Heyo! The first class of the year.
It's been a while since you
Are we having class introductions?
And King of the
Please
Castle is in a way of the
I kind of get
stream.
nervous when people come talk to me.
Welcome, class, to Surgeon 101 or Syndicate Anatomy 101. I am your educator, or otherwise known as Dr. Cyanus. I am a licensed general practice surgeon. I am a nurse practitioner and registered doctor of New Babylon Hospital, and underneath it is just the same words but written in Nefeshi to accommodate for those who can only speak Nefeshi. I have taught many surgeons in my day, but today is the day in which I educate you all on the beginnings, the first steps. But first, we will go through class introductions so that everybody is aware of your fellow classmates and so that you all, at the very least, know who each other are and who you could turn to for notes in the case that you have missed anything. So we'll start from the front right, my front right, your front left, and we'll move that direction like a snake. So, good sir, please step forward in front of the class and give your greeting to everybody.
Well, name is Zephyros Ferrum. I'm in the wrong class still, but I'm here. I'm making it.
You already paid your tuition.
No, I didn't. Did you take? Did you go on my bank account? I definitely did sign up for this.
Smiles. Just name one fun fact about yourself.
I cook a lot. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I make
Wonderful.
people eat things and eat metal.
It's very important that people are, encouraged to speak about themselves, especially in a medical field. If they aren't encouraged to speak about themselves, they might hide something that's actually ailing them in fear of not wanting to say anything at all. So next, step forward.
Paulo, buddy. And I like bones.
We're also antisocial.
Very antisocial.
You like bones? What type of bones?
Yes, any sort of bones.
Have you started utilizing femurs for their unique properties that are there within their insides?
Actually, maybe.
Did you know that femurs, as well as mostly just the bones in your legs, they're the ones that produce the most amount of blood that then is traveled throughout the rest of your body?
Yeah.
Wonderful. That means that you've already begun. You're free to take your seat.
Yay.
Next.
Hi, I'm Shion. I like knowledge.
How very wonderful. What's your favorite form of knowledge?
Am I gonna get beat if I say it?
Maybe.
Math.
Well,
And
that's
science.
quite unfortunate. Sit down. Poor creature. Poor creature. Next.
Hello, I'm Feather Maideth. I'm glad to be in this class. Fun fact about me, I suppose, would be I learned to fly jumping off buildings.
Oh. How adventurous. Well, thank you for sharing. You're free to take your seat. Next.
Hello, I'm Yuki Sparrow.
and I like to collect plants.
Plants. And you haven't kept them in darkness totally, have you, these days?
No, definitely not. They need sunlight, water, and oxygen.
Like a true mother, they are able to nurture and care for their children in whatever form. Next.
Hey, my name is Tempest Ferrum, and a little fun fact, I guess, is I like to stargaze, I suppose.
Stargazing.
Yeah. Relaxing.
Don't stare into the bright one too long, it might blind you.
Yeah, I usually don't make a habit of that, even though I have.
Oh, I see. Next, in the back.
Hey, I'm Merrick. I missed orientation both times, so I'm riding this one by the seat of my pants.
Well, introduce yourself and a fun fact about yourself.
Oh, that was me, and that was my fun fact.
Oh, okay then. Well, carry on then.
Oh, also, I have only weeks to live.
Was that a cry for
You know what? You know what? You right.
Well, I suppose that makes sense. You and your lunar cycle. Did you know that there's actually a process regarding the lunar people that we'll be going over within this class? I'm not sure specifically this. Yes, it is actually this lesson in which we will be talking over about lunesthesia and lunar anesthesia. But next, in the back. Or lunosynthesis and lunaesthesia. Yes.
Yes, I am Tsukimura Kobayashi, and I do enjoy applying knowledge that I have on helping others or sharing it with others to help them out.
How wonderful. Well, you're free to seat. And once again, for those who are just tuning in, my name is Dr. Cyanus. You can see it written up here in this giant box in the corner of your screens. But I will be doing a dual formation of this class, so if any of you have any questions out there in the chat rooms, or those of you who have questions in front of me, all you have to do is raise your hand or place your question there within the chat, and I will be able to answer you in whatever form or fashion that I see fit. So, are you all ready for today's lesson?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I'm ready.
Wonderful. Then, I suppose, we can start by going over what it is that we're here for. Lesson 1. The necessary functions for life. Within the human body, there are numerous pieces and bits and parts that all move and interact in their own formations and fashions that work together. These points of working together feature themselves in different fields, inclusive of, but not limited to, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, and the nervous system. These 4 systems that are occurring within inside the body are, integral to the existence of a human's life to being persisted. But this is not only inclusive of humans anymore. After the merger, there's been much more variables that have come into play in between such. So within this class, we'll be going over a select few types of bodies, inclusive of, but not limited to, elves, candids, felids, orcs, nefeshi, and human, amongst, I suppose, some beastkin questions that we can answer in the in-between, as well as those of the harpies. I can provide surrogate information throughout a lot of this, but let's get through the first part of the lesson first. So, make sure that you all have your notes ready, as I will be reading through this, and I will be going over these various bits and pieces as I am capable of doing so, but you will also be able to see the slides right up here in terms of the stream. Are you all ready? Well, good. Hup, hup. We'll start by going over, in a very quick formation of the words, the digestive system and its numerous pieces and parts. The first thing that I do have to read out, however, of course, is the internals. Within our bodies are a series of systems that helps us to operate and function as creatures. However, all of our systems are not completely the same. We'll be going over within this course the differences of the most common races within the Syndicate's purview, inclusive of orcs, humans, candids and felids. Nefeshi, Markin, and elves are the primary ones we will be speaking of and in reference to today. Upon completion of this lesson, you should have enough of an understanding regarding these select races and their differences between each other in relation to their physiology and their internals. We'll start first with the digestive system. The digestive system is inclusive of the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the lower and upper intestines, the bladder, the rectum, or the urinary tract. Most of those who exist within the Syndicate have normal forms of digestives, save for those of the slime folk race and shadow or void-oriented individuals, as well as most edible food sources to humans are equally as edible to many of the other races, inclusive of race-specific dietary requirements such as vegetarian, vegan, or in some cases pescatarian, due to regional availability. We'll start with the orcs. Orcs' digestive system is extremely strong and durable. Their stomach acid is in fact able to eat away at and consume the nutrients of most any object that is consumed by their strong and powerful jaws. Stemming first from the breakup of food with their strong, sharp teeth, and being crushed by the muscular tension of their esophageal canal, most food is not capable of surviving the orc and digestive tract, all except for pineapples, which to orcs interact poorly with their digestion, that usually causes upsets or at worst, vomiting. I'll give you all a moment to write that down, and if you require a repeat, then I am free to provide said repeat. I will say that one more time for the ease of those who are writing their notes. Orcs' digestive system is extremely strong and durable. Their stomach acid is able to eat away at and consume the nutrients of most any object that is consumed by their strong jaws. Stemming first from the breakup of food with their strong, sharp teeth, and being crushed by the muscular tension of their esophageal canal, most food is not capable of surviving the orc and digestive tract, all except for pineapples, which, to orcs, interact poorly with their digestion. That usually causes upsets and at worst vomiting. It is assumed that this is the case between pineapples and the orc digestive process because of some negative interaction that might be occurring between stomach bile of orcs and that of the pineapple's natural dissective properties within itself. The acidic nature of pineapples doesn't really interact well between the other two. Are there any questions about this? Yes.
Does that mean it's the same way with almost any other acidics? Because there are other things that have the same acidities or enzymes that break up.
At present time, it has only been common for the pineapples themselves to be the reason why their stomachs do not interact well with them. Other foods, such as oranges or lemons, seem to be perfectly fine in terms of citric acidity, or in terms of even an apple. Apples have their own form of digestive property that exists within themselves, but they still in their own right are fine by way of the glucose that exists within the sugars of an apple or a fruit or a tree or a branch. They still seem relatively fine in comparison to eating an apple, to those other fruits and such. Though personally I am not the utmost in terms of intelligence in relation to the nutritional benefits of many of these types of foods to the various different races, but I too, as an educator, must continue to learn. Are we ready to continue on from orcs? Raise your hands in a thumbs up, or, so on and so forth when you are prepared.
Yes.
Or jump if you are incapable of raising your hands. Are you ready? Boop, boop.
Quick question. While they get ready,
Yes.
So is the orc's acid system that breaks down everything, correct?
The digestive system overall is what breaks down the food that which orcs consume.
Mhm.
Starting with the physical breakup, all the way down to the molecular and to the nutritional benefits of where it goes from here to there, and then it just carries on.
Mhm.
Say, for instance, I suppose, you have an apple, and an orc consumes this apple. Their jaws will be strong enough to more or less crush this apple in but a few bites. And then, once that food is crushed up enough to where they can swallow it down their esophaguses, it goes all the way down, and with the crushing of their strong neck muscles down into their stomach, there it goes, getting ripped to pieces and processed, and more of the liquid nutrients that which can permeate off of the apple are being digested by the esophageal canal itself. It goes further down into the physical section, in which it is then consumed and eaten away at by the stomach bile or the stomach acid of orcs. From the stomach acid, it moves down further into the intestine tract, spreading itself out in terms of its nutrients up until it is completely removed of as many of them as possible and turning itself into excrement, be it urine or fecal matter. Any other questions?
Yeah. So could they consume things which most other races wouldn't consider food, such as, say, a tree branch?
Yes. Next question. They can, I will say, be able to digest foods or edible objects that are not commonly eaten by most civilized entities. However, they are more favorable and they do gain more of a nutritional benefit from eating that of meats, inclusive of the redder or tougher meats. In contrast, however, elven digestive systems are fairly soft, their stomach acid having trouble breaking down redder or tougher meats. As such, most elven races, save for the Dark Elves and the Drow, favor more vegetarian or vegan diets. The Dark Plainsland Elves, or Dark Elves for short, exist in contrast to their elven cousins, who exist primarily on a cannibalistic or carnivorous diet. This is similar to Drow. The Drow are more open to an omnivorous diet itself. And that's for the elven section. If you need to, I can repeat that as well for those writing down the notes on the elves. Elven digestive system.
Yes, please.
In contrast to the orc digestive system, elven digestive systems are fairly soft, their stomach acid having trouble breaking down redder or tougher meats, and as such, most elven races, save for Dark Elves and Drow, favor more vegetarian and vegan diets. The Dark Plainsland Elves, or Dark Elves for short, exist in contrast to their elven cousins who exist primarily on a cannibalistic or carnivorous diet. This is similar to Drow, though Drow are more open to an omnivorous diet. Any questions? The reason for such, as far as we can base scientifically in relation to the elven digestive system, is because of the nature of the world at which they were born from. The planet at which they generated from itself was a series of quaternary moons, more or less so with their differences in racial technicalities. It all did stem from one unified source once upon a time so very long ago. However, over time, their bodies, their digestion methods, and their ease and organs themselves evolved in different ways, thus allowing them to have a more unique outlook on life based off of the individual elves themselves. You have the wood elves, who are more prone to the raw vegetable type of foods, and less so in the nature of eating of meat, but are open to and willing to eat that of local wildlife as well as those of fish. They are more omnivorous, but more prone towards the vegetarian diet, and only will eat meat on the necessity. High elves themselves, however, view themselves to be above the need to consume the flesh of other creatures, and so they adhere themselves to a primarily strictly vegetarian to vegan diet. They don't quite often eat the meats, but if they do so in a manner that which is palatable to them and is usually garnished excessively with excess amounts of greens, inclusive of vegetables, and fruits from their local planets, or the ones at which they operate off of. Then you have those of the Drow, who, though they are more omnivorous in their methods, they are capable of eating and prefer to eat meat themselves, eating that of the weak or those at which they capture. They will, however, on occasion eat the bioluminescent plants that which persist upon the Moon Elves' planet, where the Moon Elves themselves predominantly consist themselves off of the moonlight via a method known as lunesthesia, or lunar synthesis is rather. Yes, lunar synthesis, that's the word, yes, in which they consume moonlight to be able to produce the necessary nutrients for themselves that they require within their bodies. It is unknown at present time as to why or how they're capable of doing such in a scientific format. However, there is obviously the other side of science at which we have to recognize, and being that of the unknown, or the magical in its own right. It is assumed that, by some means or fashion, moon elven digestion is permeated by an energy that which we cannot currently understand or decipher. Perhaps it stems from their fabled and theorized location of the first moon, something along those lines. But we move on. We go simple next towards human digestive systems. Human digestive systems are fairly normal and common to understand. Can't really digest metals, but is omnivorous to all other forms of edible nourishment. Fairly common and fairly similar to those of your normal human anatomy studies. Mouth, esophagus, stomach, intestines, urine, fecal. Similar format, similar fashion. The only oddities that stem from human diets is that, despite themselves, stomach acid itself has the potential to be able to melt down harsher materials such as metals and other non-commonly degradable sources of material and whatnot, but is capable of doing so, though it does not generate enough nutritional value to the human for it to be a viable form or consistent form of food. However, there is some metal that which humans can chew that allows for them to be able to stress relieve in a similar sense of that of gum. Are there any questions? Yes.
Why is it always the thing that people tell you can't eat gum, or it's staying you for long periods of time? Because isn't that false?
It is not so false as it seems. There is oftentimes a worry by most doctors or accredited scientists at present time that believe that because of gum and its sticky residue and its nature for not degrading as much or easy as many other forms of degradable, consumable objects, it also stems from its source, being gum's production from rubber trees in general themselves. Gum and or rubber are not things at which humans technically should consume, as they don't really provide a true nutritional benefit beyond for simple sakes of strengthening the jaw and filling your stomach for a bit of time to make it perceive that it is no longer hungry. By chewing something, your mind thinks that you are eating something, and the sweet taste that comes off of gum itself, when it drains back into your stomach by way of saliva, it pretends. It makes it seem as if you are gaining something, but it is mostly just a lie to yourself. The reason why scientists believe that that it would be unwise to eat or consume gum is because they believe it might stick to the sides of your body in some form or fashion, or inclusive of, your intestines themselves, and then create blockages that'll lead towards medical issues such as constipation or ruptures, or just in general scratch or carve away at the stomach lining of the stomach and cause ulcers, or potentially increase the likelihood of ulcers as well. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions before we continue? Yes.
You mentioned the first moon. What is that?
That's for your history class teacher to educate you on. But if there are no other questions in relation to human, yes.
This is for the elves and humans. What are so for humans, they able to digest some metals, but are orcs able to still be able to digest metals as well?
Yes. And they receive a slight bit more of the nutritional benefits of a specific iron, such as zinc and iron, versus a human who would more or less just be consuming the metal itself, and likely would get sick due to the chemical processing that is required to be able to create these metals in a format that can be consumed other than just eating rocks.
Mm-hmm. And I know it was Drows that had mainly a meat diet, right?
Yes.
No, it was the okay.
Drow and dark elves, or dark plainsland elves, are the ones who predominantly eat meat amongst those types. Wood elves are capable of doing so, but don't do so due to societal desires. Preservation of life and nature and all that jazz, and those of the high elves don't often eat it due to the belief that it is below them to consume the flesh of the living. Are there any other questions? There are no questions amongst the chat rooms, so I shall continue. We will go then next to the Markin, or those of the fish lands, or the watery waves. Markin digestive systems are more suited to a pescatarian diet, due to their regional requirements needing bodies of water to facilitate their cohabitation with the surface folk. Their desire to eat more fish is less a biological need, and more so a societal promotion. It is common for the Markin to practice their swimming, in fact, through the practice of fishing, where they present themselves or their children with spears, and they say, "Swim after the fish and try to catch something for dinner." And if the kids are able to, then they are praised, and if they are not, then they are educated, for most well-suited households amongst the Markin. Would you like for me to repeat that section?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, please. So Merkin, they overall are pescatarians just by their society norms, but they can't eat like normal cows, pigs. They can eat normal, like mundane human food. They just choose not to.
Yes. It's less so about a choice, however. They are not often able to reach or even meet cows where they come from. The only reason that they are capable of doing so is through common trade conducted between their tribes or their cities and those of the surface lands. In preparation of fish, they provide meats of cow or something of that sort, or seaweeds, or proper and gains of fishing, and they cohabitate in that form or fashion. We'll go over here next, really quick.
Is it because some meats, when it comes to fish, are considered still red meats and not white meats in the comparisons?
Indeed. Some of these sorts of fish, however unfortunate that it might be, are not the best to consume for either humans or the plants or the Markin themselves. This is inclusive of pufferfish, who within their bodies contain toxins that would paralyze and inevitably kill an entity that consumed them or prepared them incorrectly. Even Markin are susceptible to this, though they do, however, similar to their dolphin friends that they do have communications with, sometimes do huff the watery vapor form of these poisons so that they can get high. They consider it or classify it in a form or fashion, in the more rural sense, of puffer pass. Yes.
Are things like fugu technically more considered amongst their civilizations, even as a food?
Repeat that.
Fugu, it's pufferfish cut up properly by like master chefs.
They don't have
You
that many
technically
people
have to
like
go to
that
years
out
of
there.
culinary.
Fugu's already hard enough to do it for normal humans.
Indeed.
So
Yes.
So this is just for my notes. So humans and Merkin are pretty much the same on their digestive systems. It's just pescatarians.
Yes. In a sense, you could say so. Aside from their respiratory systems, but we'll get to that later. Any other questions? You wanted me to repeat it? Yes? Yes, no, yes, no. I will repeat it one more time. Markan digestive systems are more suited to a pescatarian diet due to their regional requirements needing bodies of water to facilitate their cohabitation with the surface folk. Their desire to eat more fish is less a biological need and more so a societal promotion. It is common for the Markan to practice their swimming through the practice of fishing. Any questions? Then we shall move on next to the candid digestive systems. Candid digestive systems are similar to their canine counterparts, but are more accommodating to certain berries, such as blueberries and strawberries, that dogs would not be able to accommodate for. In contrast to their canine counterparts, candids are capable of regurgitation, yet are weaker to non-low-fat or skimmed milks. Candids are, however, blessed with a slow metabolism and as such require less food over long distances of time. I will repeat that one more time for you all. Candid digestive systems are similar to their canine counterparts, but are more accommodating to certain berries, such as blueberries and strawberries, that dogs would not be able to accommodate for as well. In contrast to their canine counterparts, candids are capable of regurgitation, yet are weaker to non-low-fat or skimmed milks. Candids are, however, blessed with a slow metabolism and as such require less food over long distances of time, meaning that their bodies will be able to grow at a relatively regular pace but require less food to be able to do so, allowing for the nutrients at which they consume to be extended or prolonged through a longer period of time, where to us a minute goes by normally, the metabolism of a canine would carry on every 30 seconds, essentially. So if you were to look at a clock, if we have a clock in here, we don't. Then just picture as I do this, just drawing a circle on the chalkboard. You cut it in half. Half of that time is dedicated towards the processing and the placement of the nutrients where they need them to go, specifically within their digestive system. The other half is the actual processing method of the consumption of those nutrients within the candid's body. Beyond that, they are pretty similar to that of a humanoid. However, that is their primary difference in terms of how quickly they digest and metabolize food itself. Any questions? Yes.
So vulpins and things like that would still fall within the candid familia, correct? For their certain types or differences in because of regions and things they tend to?
Vulpins, however, are a bit more different in that sense, where they don't quite have the lower metabolism that a candid does. In fact, they do consume a touch bit more over a longer period of time. However, their bodies are usually much more lithe or skinnier, and so require less food to be able to conduct the same amount. The trade-offs being the physiological differences versus the internal differences. The internal differences between a Candid and a Vulpin being that their bodies do not require the same amount, but are able to produce the same amount with the same amount of things, in different formats. A Vulpin would grow taller than a Candid, but the Candid would grow stronger than a Vulpin if they ate the same foods for a year, as long as those foods were nutritious. Yes.
So with the Candid, so to reiterate, they able to eat less and don't have to eat for a long period of time.
Yeah, well, not a long period of time, but they are able to eat less and be able to consume less over a longer period of time. Where if you look at, say, for instance, you have a Candid who is stranded on an island, and he has one coconut that he is able to eat. He consumes the milk and eats the flesh of this coconut, and is able to sustain himself off of both that coconut and the flesh of that coconut for around 2 weeks in terms of that, versus a human who would more or less digest it within 3 days to a week, depending on hydration levels. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
We have a question from the chat of would the intestines of Candids, Felids, and other primarily carnivorous kinfolk be shorter compared to their human counterparts to accommodate the diet? Now this is in fact not true. Though Candids and Felids do primarily consume that of meats, they are still capable of an omnivorous diet. And, as such, depending on the size of the individual human's body or the individual Candid or Felid's body, that is how long it would technically take for the food itself to traverse through the intestines themselves. However bundled and jumbled up they were, and however long it was, ultimately is based off of the speed of their own digestive systems versus the length of their intestines themselves, their intestinal tracts themselves. Hopefully that answered your question out there in TV land. Do we have any final questions before we continue on? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we shall now move on next to the Felids. Felid digestive systems are similar to their feline counterparts, but are more accommodating towards more bitter or pungently flavored, spicier food. In contrast to their feline counterparts, Felids need only really make contact physically with certain foods to be able to get a sense of what the potential taste would be. Unless they are nose blind in some form or fashion and have a more accommodating sense of taste, Felid tongues are not barbed, but can be when individuals have ascended beyond their base template form of a Felid. Any questions in relation to that?
Can you repeat?
Yes.
I was trying to get the wording.
Felid digestive systems are similar to their feline counterparts, but are more accommodating towards more bitter or pungently flavored, spicier food. In contrast to their feline counterparts, Felids need only really make contact physically with certain foods to be able to get a taste or a sense of what the potential taste would be. Unless, of course, they are nose blind in some form or fashion and have a more accommodating sense of taste. Felid tongues are not barbed, but can be when individuals have ascended beyond the base template form of a Felid. For example, if I placed an apple or a banana on the table, a Felid would need only be able to touch the skin or the exterior of that apple or banana, and would be able to understand at what level of ripeness or decay this banana presently was. And they would know based off of the taste, and it would most likely, if it was rotting or decaying, taste quite terrible. But they would be able to tell whether or not it would be edible for them to eat, by way of simply touching it and tasting. Are there any other questions? then we can in fact move on. We will move on to the final section of my informative sections of the digestive systems and lead you on next into the Nefeshi. Nefeshi contain a stomach bile that eats away at most foods, however, prefers and gains the most from fresh humanoid meats that can be dissolved amongst the acids and decay, pseudo-feeding them. But, more so than just decaying within the stomach, their stomach lining is what, upon turning into a Nefeshi, is turned into the stomach bile commonly found and seen within the blighter populace. However, it is not capable of reproduction and must be replaced physically by the Nefeshi if their stomach is removed or pierced or damaged, spilled of its contents. Nefeshi do not have a gag reflex, and as such cannot vomit. Nutrients are absorbed through the decaying or rotting process food goes through to benefit the Nefeshi consumer. I will repeat that for you all now. Nefeshi contain a stomach bile that eats away at most foods, however, prefers and gains the most from fresh humanoid meats that can be dissolved amongst the acids and decay, in a sense defined as pseudo-feeding. But more so, just decaying within the stomach, their stomach lining is what, upon turning into a Nefeshi, is turned into the stomach bile commonly found and seen within the blighter populace. However, it is not capable of reproduction and must be replaced physically by the Nefeshi if their stomach is removed or pierced or damaged or spilled of its contents. Nefeshi do not have a gag reflex and as such cannot vomit. Nutrients are absorbed through the decaying or rotting process food goes through to benefit the Nefeshi consumer in which they are rotting or decaying there within. Are there any questions? Yes, in the back.
You mentioned the blighter populace. What's that?
The blighter populace. That is the populace of a form of Nefeshi that persists among the sewers of many of these cities that have underground sewerways, that are large bulbous entities that which produce acids from their stomach and spew them out or explode upon death to cover an area in acid to area of a deny, or consume easier large quantities of flesh or substances that which the blighters seek to consume. They are a form of Nefeshi. We'll go here, and then we'll go to the bird. Yes?
This question about other, like, kinfolk digestive systems, like the ram and the harpy folk. Would they categories in the other fields over you already talked about, or they have their own separate digestive system?
For the harpies, they are more prone to carnivorous acts. They aren't quite so commonly vegetarian as up in the highest mountains. It's quite difficult for the air quality to be able to produce enough greenery or vegetation for them to consume. As such, they go about their days teaching their children how to hunt smaller birds and smaller prey, and in a sense both educate them physically on how to hunt, as well as more on how to consume the food of which they're eating, turning into their harpy-winged forms and dive-bombing down on their prey and snapping the necks of small rodents or creatures, or larger prey for the larger harpies, such as deer, or even some forms of elk and moose. As for the ram folk, they, however, are the ones who are able to traverse from the ground to the upward area, but are more commonly seen consuming vegetables or greenery in general than that of carnivorous actions. They are not incapable of consuming meat, but they are unlikely to go about killing or hunting down other meat-oriented organisms to consume them out of their own free will. They are able to kill each other, they are able to harm people, but it is unlikely that they will go out of their way to kill or consume for the purposes of feeding themselves. They will, however, consume grasses and greens and foliage and things of that nature. And unlikely, but it inevitably would likely happen, they might consume small bugs just because they're on the trees or plants or leaves themselves. But that would do nothing, really, against them. Let's see here. We have 2 questions within the chat. Also, thank you, Itzran, for follow. The first question would be, how would turning Nefeshi affect other species except human? And it more or less just affects them all the same, changing their dietary formats and fashion to desire the consumption of humanoid entities' flesh, and more raw or rarer, the rarest forms of meats are the most delectable for Nefeshi. In any format or template. The second one is, I am aware that this isn't talked about, but would kinfolk like Bovinets have 4 stomachs like their animal counterparts? And how is the acidity of the stomach acid of constrictor type of snake kinfolk? Is that different compared to the other races? Now, for Bovinet, they do not have 2 stomachs similar to that of their animalistic counterparts. They do, however, have extremely strong and processable stomachs themselves. They only really truly eat those of the vegetable or vegetarian dietary, format, as consumption of meat isn't really required for them. But the times that they do consume the vegetarian type of meats and diet, such as the grasses or kales or vegetables, salads, carrots, greens, so on and so forth, it is quite easy for it to be dissolved in a relatively quick manner, such is why they more or less snack throughout the days, as ultimately it is them literally requiring to eat more to be able to function for longer periods of time. As for constrictor type of snakes, or snake kinfolk in general, or the reptiliae, snakes in general would also in that same sense be able to consume similar to that of candids over a longer period of time. The metabolism of a snake is only operated in what seems to be waves, similar to that of a snake's molting cycle, in which the snake will consume up the nutrients and required tastes and whatnots that they required up until that point to be able to facilitate growing beyond their current layer of skin, allowing for them to molt and grow larger in the next cycle at which they conduct themselves. Essentially, they build up, they remove, and they grow. Hopefully that answered your questions there at home. But is there any other questions in relation to this before I continue on? Yes.
My question earlier was just to confirm the only source for the Nefeshi stomach bile is from, what's it called? Blighters?
Not specifically. For most Nefeshi, it is reviewed and commonly seen that blighters are the ones who produce a great deal amount of stomach bile, that which is able to produce and continuously line their stomachs. However, other Nefeshi types, such as base resurrected or Wendigos, some Wendigos don't even have stomachs and simply just eat and it falls out of them and they remain ever hungry. But it is commonly believed that those who are connected to lichdoms are able to, in a sense, facilitate their digestion through the decaying process that exists there within them, but not so much so the blighters. The blighters, in fact, seem to lose a great deal amount of their reproductive capabilities of their stomach lining when joining into a lichdom. This is in part due to the belief that because they no longer produce or contain self-will or free will, they are incapable of being able to automatically, in their own dulled or diminished form of mental functioning, be able to produce their own stomach lining once again. The only way that they can do so is through the production of more acids themselves, that which they spew out and coat the inside of their stomachs when doing so, but it usually gets removed whenever they explode or they, shoot it out to consume or melt an opponent or an attacker. Yes.
So for Nefeshi, could they end up still doing it without the bile through the natural decomposition process and composting, technically?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? You look like you have questions. We'll start with you in the back.
Ultra specific one. Can a Nefeshi moon elf still use lunar synthesis to gain sustenance?
Yes, in fact. There was at one time in my researches and my history of learning that there was, in fact, priests who kept large populations of moon elves for the purposes of becoming food sources for them, where if the moon elves were fed, they, the priests, would no longer require having to eat, and as such would go out of their way to produce or cultivate large populations of moon elves to be able to then turn them into Nefeshi at some point in their death cycle, and then from there have near infinitely producing food sources in general for themselves. Though this process is able to be reproduced in many different forms and formats, such as inclusive of the Jotun populace, where Jotuns no longer require food, and as such, if you have more Jotuns within your lichdom, you would be able to exist for longer periods of time without the need to consume, similar to that of a Jotun. Any other questions? Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Coolio. Let's see here. Do I have anything else in relation to digestive system that I need to educate you all on? If you have no other questions, then we can... Yes.
I know that the Nefeshis don't have gag reflexes, but for curiosity, if we know that we can produce and have a child, would they ever get, like, morning sickness reflex of a way?
Unlikely. The idea that an Nefeshi could reproduce is in itself near impossible. The only forms of Nefeshi that could reproduce are those who are granted life in some form or are able to simulate it in such a way that it is able to be produced within their dead corpses. This has been conducted a couple of times in recent history, if you might know, where Nefeshi have been able to produce living children. That is an extremely rare and uncommon occurrence entirely, and is likely only to ever be reproduced by that of priests themselves. Disciples could never birth living children, and it is unlikely that they ever could, and it would in that case would only be able to be conducted between two disciples in the first place. Or a priest and a disciple in that sense. Any other questions? 5 forward, 3, 2, 1, and... Woo! Come back to me, Hip. There we go. Then I will be moving on into the next section of our lesson. This is in relation to the respiratory system. The respiratory systems of these different races that permeate around our world are all, in a sense, fairly similar due to our need for oxygen in the first place. However, not all of the races that exist within our dear Mother Earth are capable of breathing the same oxygen format as we are. Some, inclusive of the Moon Elves, are able to conduct themselves, or were once capable of conducting themselves without the need for oxygen in the first place. Moon Elves were, once upon a time, a race who did not require oxygen at all, specifically to breathe at the very least, but were able to sustain themselves fully through their lunar synthesis or lunesthesia, as it is classified. Lunar synthesis, or lunesthesia as they called it, was the process in which lunar elves, or moon elves in general, were able to look up into the sky or find their way to their local moon mother, the centralized core of that moon or source, and be able to bathe or bask in the light and the glow of their said energy sources, and be able to produce or fuel themselves off of it in the first place. Oftentimes, the energy of a lunar core was able to permeate itself throughout every tunnel and every passageway of a lunar society, bathing them in the warmth of their mother's love, but also able to give unto them the nutrients required to persist within the depths of space, to be warm in the empty vastness of cold, and to breathe in the empty vastness of the silent airs at which they breathed. But to backtrack a bit, the respiratory system is inclusive of the mouth, the lungs, the blood cells that carry the oxygen throughout the body and back into the lungs to thus be exhaled as carbon dioxide. These systems function relatively the same. However, some of the more tribalistic Markin are unable to breathe oxygen, as many of the civilized world are capable of, and as such stick to their lonely reefs deep beneath the waves. In the case of Markin, their lungs come paired with a set of gills that are placed upon their necks and filter the oxygen in the water through their gills. Now let me zoom in for you all really quickly as I show you on the diagram where specifically it is that I am in reference to for this. As there is a diagram placed on the screen, if you can see my cursor, it is right about just between the tonsils and the pharynx, in which their gills usually begin, and ends just below the larynx and the pharynx, in terms of where their gills are usually situated upon a Markin. Is there any questions in relation to that? Or anything of which I just related to in speech? Yes.
Very simple Munov question. Does what we mentioned there imply they're also resistant to the difference in pressure in the vacuum of space?
It was likely due to some form of cajoling by way of their lunar cores at which they utilized. Produced amongst themselves at one time a form of gravity or atmosphere that which they could live in or persist within. However, I am unaware, as we are not currently in a time in which we have easy access to being able to research or learn about such a thing. Are there any questions? The next section for respiratory system that I will be going over in this relates to lunastatic shock. Lunastatic shock is when solar energy, or a great deal amount of solar rays in some form or fashion, interferes with the breathing or functions of a moon elf or lunar-oriented patient's breathing and causes them to essentially suffocate and be sent into seizure-like shock due to said interference. The way to fix this would be to slowly calm them down and coax them through a basic breathing routine, similar to that of an in and an out repeated around 10 times. Do we have any volunteers who would like to act as examples for this?
Sure, why not?
We will not be inducing a lunastatic shock into you, but please step forward. Everybody, meet your classmate, Marek. Now, the process of somebody going through lunastatic shock would be visible as such. If somebody such as a moon elf were going through lunastatic shock, you would see that their eyes would begin to dim and glow, and the area around their eyes would be feeling very, very dry and sunken in, as if they are losing more of their mass simply by way of conduction. They would also most likely be shaking within their hands. Their hands would be shaking and their bodies would be starting to twist and crouch together amongst themselves, and they'd be losing control of their systems and their bodies. This is inclusive of their breathing, where they'd be short of breath, upwards to the point of being choked by their own inability to form or inhale by expansion, or deflating and inhaling and upwards and downward movement of the diaphragm. They would then inevitably fall over on the ground and begin having seizures, as the oxygen within their brain would be so minimal and so tainted, I suppose, by external energies that they themselves would begin to die. The way to fix this would be to slowly calm them down and coax them, placing your hand on their shoulder and placing it on their chest to coax them and assist their breathing, saying in and out, reminding them of how to breathe as a normal humanoid entity, where you insert oxygen into their heads and their lungs, saying breathing in and out. And you would do so 10 times at least in total for the first cycle of conduction in terms of treating lunesthetic shock. After that, you would lay them down on their back. You would have their hands outsplayed with their palms towards the sky, and you would give them enough space and enough room to breathe and return back to their normal cycle of lunesthesia or lunar synthesis. The difference between these is pretty much irrelevant, as they are both technically the same, but lunar synthesis is where they more so just simply consume the energy of the moon or the lunar entities themselves, and are able to feed themselves off of it, versus lunesthesia, in which they are able to provide more to their systems overall. Are there any questions in relation to this?
What's the mechanical difference between those two processes?
One feeds, the other provides the necessary nutrients and the oxygen equivalents for their capability to survive or sustain themselves. One would be able to conduct lunesthesis. One would be able to conduct lunesthesis by way of simply existing near a window and feeding themselves off the moonlight that came in. But lunesthesia would be able to be conducted by way of, usually wearing more revealing clothing that then was able to reach closer towards their chest region more often, to be able to intake oxygen, or the oxygen equivalent to a lunar entity, directly towards their lungs, thus providing them the same necessities that oxygen and, the respiratory system conducts for most other organic life forms that which permeate upon two legs as we do.
What is this shock called again?
Lunesthetic shock. I can spell it out for you all. LUNASTHETIC. And then shock. Does everybody have that? Any questions in relation to what has been defined presently within the respiratory systems?
So,
If
other than
yes, reminder to raise your hand.
Other than supernatural means, how might lunesthetic shock occur?
It can also occur whenever a lunar entity is overheated. Did you bring enough for the class?
Damn,
I
fuck.
was just doing it.
Fuck.
I was just doing
Damn,
it.
my bad.
That's unfortunate.
I mean, I got a sandwich for the teacher. I got the other half, but I can't share this whole fucking sandwich with the class.
It's really unfortunate. But in terms of inducting lunesthetic shock, aside from inducting solar energy into somebody, it could occur by way of simply being outside for too long and a sense of heat stroke. Heat stroke is something that can occur when the mind is getting overheated and the systems and the blood itself is beginning to boil, thus causing the brain to overload and essentially conk out and form you into a seizure, usually. Those who go through heat stroke are more susceptible to heat stroke, and I, in fact, have gone through at least 3 heat strokes in my life. Any other questions before I continue? Yes, Zephyrus.
What would be the process to help with heat stroke when it's happening?
The process to help somebody with heat stroke is as simple as such. Get them out of the direct sunlight as quickly as possible. Try not to jostle them around or move them around too quickly. Do your best to be able to cool them down by way of placing cold pads or something of that nature on their shoulders, their heads, their faces, their necks, their cheeks in general, as well as to cool down their hands and their legs. Because with homeostasis, did you know that, well, I'm supposed to educate you a bit on homeostasis. It is the state in which your blood is utilized to be able to transfer the correct information to the rest of your body to generate and or produce your internal temperature. So, if your homeostasis is incorrect, your body temperature would be rapidly increased or decreased, depending on the reason why it was being fooled with. If you are able to cool down your hands and your feet, or the feet and hands of the patient that which is going through a heat stroke, their internal core temperature would thus begin to lower, and their minds would be able to return back to themselves in a relatively slow but groggy fashion. This is also inclusive over the head, but you do not want them to be overstimulated or go into shock. If somebody is going through heat stroke, you do not put them into absolutely cold temperatures. Do not interact with them with any form of liquid nitrogen or permafrosting capabilities. You will most likely kill them in that sense, as the rapid shift in temperatures within their body could cause a dysfunction to such a degree that it might rupture blood vessels internally or just outright disable their systems entirely and kill them, similar to that of an EMP onto a machine. Any questions? Yes.
So would lunastatic shock almost be equivalent to a panic attack, more or less?
A panic attack with a
Looking at the
seizure
ways
attached.
of... Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Would lunar entities then be more susceptible to heat stroke?
Yes. Elves overall are generally more susceptible to heat stroke itself. All save for mostly the high elves, but their means of being able to contend against heat stroke is mainly consistent in the format or fashion of windier climates higher up in elevation. It's a lot colder where the wind blows versus on the ground where the slaves wander. Any other questions?
What?
Yes.
Is there equivalent to the solar elves?
The solar elves no longer persist in our worlds, as far as I'm aware at least, or scientifically the world is aware. Long since dead. Any other questions? Five forward. 3, 2. 1 and... Coolio. Oh, we do have one question in the chat. Would freezing a couple of wet towels and placing them on the limbs and head of someone experiencing heat stroke help? I would say yes. However, you do not want it to remain there or be stationary on their body. You want it to spread the coolness across the entirety of their arms or skin in general, versus, over their torso. You want to spread it over their legs up to around the midpoint of the knee, as well as all the way up to around just where the shoulder line is, so that their heat can be done away with in a relatively quicker fashion overall. But you do want it to remain on the backside of their hands and the top sides of their feet. Do not place it on their palms, as you might ultimately disrupt something, or in waking up they might grab onto it too roughly and either break the item itself and cause it to get everywhere and potentially damage something or themselves, or it might hurt them and cause strain within their wrists or the muscles within their wrists and cause a ligament break or a tendon break. The human body and the body of most mammals and sapien types is quite a marvel in itself. Yes.
So, even with the Moon Elves going into lunastatic shock, even with the seizure aspect, should you still restrain them like you should a seizing patient, so as not to like bite down on their tongue and or swallow their tongues, things like that?
There are two instruments of medical fields that we have educated ourselves enough in to be able to utilize for those who are conducting themselves in a lunatic shock or a seizure. You do not want to bind somebody down when they are having a seizure too much. You want them to remain in a place where they're not going to fall and hurt themselves, but you do not want to restrain them, as strain on the muscles might cause more internal rips and tears of their tendons, ligaments, or joints in general. Their muscles, however strong they might be, are still capable of tearing, as that is how both muscle growth occurs, but also how strain itself is produced. Before you ask that question, the first instrument that you would have is similar to that of an OPA, otherwise defined as an oropharyngeal airway. This is a hard plastic, curved, spoon-like object that doesn't have the dip of a spoon that you place within somebody's mouth, where the lip is going up, or the curve of this pharyngeal airway device is going up, and you twist it as you push it down to where it is placing a lot of its strained energy onto the tongue, so that the tongue remains compressed. You would do so that way so that the people who are having a seizure would not bite down on their tongue, choke on their tongue, and be able to bite down on something that is both hard but is not going to damage their teeth in such a way that it would break them. Oropharyngeal airways. The second one would be more so just a rudimentary band of leather that which we have available in most stores nowadays, where they would bite down on the leather, and the leather itself would keep their tongue compressed away from their teeth, but the leather would be bitten down on by the teeth and be able to in a sense, act as a focus for their mind to be able to just hold on for dear life as they are running through this seizure. Are there any questions about that?
So,
yes.
So if someone's having a seizure, the best place to put them would be on a soft surface, being a bed or air mattress or stuff like that.
The best place to place somebody who is having a seizure or heat stroke related seizure, lunasthenic seizure, would be to place them in a cold area, colder or shaded area, on the ground, laying down flat, with their arms, in the recovery position, with one hand on the top of their ear, the other draped across their chest, their leg essentially folded up a bit and laying on the side to provide them stability when they are laying on their side. Enough so to, if they throw up, that the vomit will not stay pooled within their lungs or their mouth, and will be able to drain out of their body. This is classified as the recovery position. You would place somebody who is on the outbound portion of a seizure, lunatic shock or something of that sort, in the recovery position, so that they would be able to more or less come to their senses on their own terms without the worry, the risk of, suffocation, vomit, drowning, etc., etc., etc. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Wonderful. Is there anything else before I continue? 5-4. Yes.
Once they have recovered from the seizure, is there anything we need to look for, watch out for, or do?
Watch their eyes. If you are able to see their eyes and their eyes are dilating and expanding rapidly, then it's likely that there's something more neurological going on within their brain, and they will definitely need to seek a hospital. Though that is also a sign that their mind is being overloaded by way of the heat itself, and as such would be a sign both prior and afterward of a seizure or a heat stroke related injury to something neurologically going on. I'll let you all write that down for now. We will move on from lunatic shock, heat stroke, as well as in general, just seizures and so on. Let's see here. From Luna, would aquatic kinfolk be more likely to suffer a heat stroke when outside of the water compared to other species? They would go through what is essentially the opposite of a frostbite, where it is more so their body would get so dried out and calloused and caked in their own dead skin cells that they would essentially dry up and become cracked and calloused to the point that it would cause micro tears within their skin. Mostly in the sense of really rough calluses due to drying out that would inevitably cause large rips and lacerations in the flesh of a American. But we'll move on. We'll now look towards those of the harpy divination. Those who are harpies have a lot of an easier time with their lungs in being able to reproduce, or not reproduce, to cycle oxygen through their respiratory system. Now, why is this? Because harpies are capable of flight, and as such their bones themselves are a lot thinner in terms of what they are, in fact are hollow, they still produce oxygen. But, not produce oxygen, produce blood cells. But a harpy requires less oxygen to be able to conduct themselves, or less pure oxygen to be able to conduct themselves because of such. Because there is less bone and much less weight for them to have to be able to cart along throughout the sky, and their bodies themselves are relatively smaller or more fragile. The oxygen that is required in terms of levels of oxygenation within the air for them to be sustained is a lot less. As such, you will see harpies are most likely to be the last person to fall unconscious if they are placed in a room with gradually decreasing oxygen levels. The first people being humanoids likely to go unconscious first, and then next it would be the orcs, and then the elves, and then the harpies afterward. Now, why is this that the orcs would be the next? Because they require so much more oxygen to be able to exist within their respiratory system, so much more cycled through their blood vessels and their veins and capillaries and arteries, that they require deeper and larger breaths to be able to sustain themselves. If they are without oxygen enough to sustain themselves for normal orcan breaths, they would most likely fall unconscious next, directly after humans, who though require less oxygen than an orc, are able to sustain less oxygen than an orc in the first place. Any questions as such regarding that? Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Wonderful. The respiratory system of different races and entities that permeate on our world is ultimately out beyond my own comprehension and understanding. There are many different races that permeate and exist, such as slime folk. Slime folk don't technically require oxygen to be able to exist, but do require it to remain moisturized within the area. If slime folk dries out, then they will likely harden to a point in which their gelatinous form turns into a more solidified rock and then crack before breaking apart. Let's see here. A question from the people at home. Would kinfolk that have a connection with species that are used to living in high altitudes, like mountain goat kinfolk, for example, have a higher lung capacity or less need for oxygen compared to those who do not have that connection? No. Now, the reason why this does not occur is because while mountain goats are capable of traversing that height, they do so at such a speed in which it is ultimately acclimatizing themselves to such a point as they rise up into the mountain ranges, as well as their bodies themselves are smaller than our own. This body of a mountain goat is not the same as the body of a humanoid, in which a mountain goat's primary functions do not require as much oxygen being fed into the brain as they would require for themselves. This isn't saying that ram folk are stupider than most other species, but it is saying that goats and rams and mountain rams are of a lesser intelligence than their humanoid counterparts being of the ram folk. Ram folk, as such, are able to have the same level of intelligence, or greater than in some cases, such as the great philosopher king known as Socrates, who was once an old ram of the Italian region. Greek, in fact, not the Italians. They all get mixed up to me. But he was able to survive off of less oxygen due to being in an already mountainous climate himself, being that of the region or the mountains of Greece itself, and oftentimes permeating himself in very high locations such as pantheons and the Acropolis and all these other large mountainous points. Are there any questions in relation to that? Yes.
What about when it comes to the colder regions of the world? Because it's known to be in certain colder regions like the Arctic and the South Pole that there is less oxygen there due to the pole.
In relation to colder climates, oxygen levels within these locations doesn't so much change, but the levels in which they are presented are less so equivalent to that of, say, a more humid region. If you look at the humid regions of a rainforest, for instance, the oxygen levels there within that are synonymous with the rest of the areas outside of that rainforest, but are more permeated by humid water molecules at which carry on the heat from the sun and whatnot amongst themselves and produce a humid, arid temperature. The reason why it's difficult sometimes to breathe in rainforests is because the level of water that you're breathing in is less so than the amount of oxygen that you're consuming. This is equally as such whenever you locate yourselves within a colder climate. However, it is a lot more dense of a substance versus a more vaporous water molecule in the air of a humid or swampy land such as Louisiana, or rainforest such as the Amazon. You would find that whenever you look around in, say, the Antarctic, if you are caught in a blizzard and all you have is your heavy-duty winter coat, that the oxygen will be difficult for you to breathe in because you are mostly breathing in the snow and the water vapor that has condensed itself into snow particulates and or just ice particulates that are coating the inside of your mouth and down into your lungs and making it heavier oxygenated breaths for you to try to have to cycle. It is difficult, but yes.
Does that mean technically for the kin, say like Ursins of the polar variety and Vulpins of the polar variety would end up having easier times breathing in those areas since that is more what they're acclimated towards?
If we're referencing specifically Ursine folk, their lungs are adapted in terms of polar bear Ursine folk. Their lungs are adapted to be able to accommodate for both aquatic and the frigid temperatures of the Antarctic itself. Now, why is this? Because, well, polar bears themselves require the ability to be able to sustain themselves in longer periods of time underwater, as well as on the land. Their fur itself even clinging more oxygen to it by way of its own production. However, polar bears themselves don't so often really represent, or Ursine folk, rather, don't so much operate or represent that need for greater... What's the word for this, I suppose? homeostasis is the word that I'm looking for in this, as their bodies are naturally condensed or insulated with warmth, that the oxygen that they breathe in within their climates and their territories usually is able to separate the water molecules from itself to the oxygenated molecules that are within a breath of air, thus making it both a hydrating breath, but also one that which potentially could, drown them if it went down the wrong pipe. But yes.
And on the other fact of the polar Vulpins?
For the polar Vulpins, more so the frigid variants, the snow foxes and people of that nature, it is more likely, in my terms of my scientific understanding, that snow Vulpins are easier to be able to interact within their environment and breathe in their environment due to their size as well as their coat. Their coat, allowing for the insulation similar to that of a polar bear in general, allows for them to stay warmer in these climates and push away the cold that which permeates upon most entities that persist within those areas. They, however, are usually smaller entities themselves and thus require less oxygen itself to permeate. The best oxygen, and this you should all write down, the best oxygen that exists within the world is around 3 feet above the ground. Now, why is this? Because a great deal amount of the tainted or corrupted, polluted air generally tends to hang above the 3-foot line and up above. It's also usually produced by entities that are 3 foot taller or above. This is inclusive of vehicles, of industry, of diesel, of the flying machines and cars that drive through the streets. Pollution itself makes it difficult for the respiratory systems to function further up you go. This is inclusive of, but not limited to, that of similarly, in general, altitude, where the higher up you go into the air, the more fragile and thin the air will become. This is due in part due to the nature of gravity and how oxygen, the more pure, the more dense of oxygen, the more pure of oxygen, is closer towards the ground because the gravity is what pulls it further and closer towards the earth. Are there any more questions in relation to this? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and... Wonderful. I've gone over everything I needed to in relation to the respiratory system. Hello, my dear cat. You've taken my chair, and now you claim it as your own and get mad at me when I want to get into it. Don't you bite me, nerd. I will fight you. Go on now. Anyway, let me move my slides for everybody at home to the next line of inquiry, and allow for them to be able to more specifically see this next section. As the next sections that we will be going over are as follows. The circulatory system. Oh, lordy jeez. I suggest everybody who is currently in the classroom to tune into the stream to be able to see this, but I will be going and reading over the notes that are specifically from the slides in this section here. I'll give you all a chance to be able to open them up and raise your hand when you are ready. Or jump if you are incapable of raising your hand. Wonderful. Then allow for me to educate you a bit on the circulatory system. The circulatory system, much like many of the other systems, begins with the nose or the mouth. By way of inhaling of oxygen, you receive the oxygen molecules that go through the air and get transferred into your lungs, which within your lungs then circulates that and connects those oxygen molecules to your blood cells. Blood cells go from your lungs into your heart and then are sent out in numerous pumps and palpitations throughout your body and throughout your arteries and veins and capillaries, throughout the rest of your body. But to make it more kosher, I suppose, I will be reading from the slides and allowing you all the chance to be able to read and regurgitate the information as follows. Blood circulates through the heart, which pumps it to the lungs and the rest of the body. When blood circulates from the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen, it is called pulmonary circulation. When blood circulates to the rest of the body, it is called systemic circulation. The blood picks up oxygen inhaled into the lungs and delivers it through blood vessels called arteries to the rest of the body. The lub-dub heartbeat, or dun, is the sound of the heart's valves opening and closing as the heart muscle contracts and squeezes the blood on its way. Tell me, does anybody in here know the hand movements required to be able to stimulate a heart in its palpitations? Does anybody think that they can recreate it? Do so with your hand if you think you know the right way. You would actually be able to do it with one hand. It wouldn't be as advised to do it with one hand, but if you place your hand around a human heart, you would be able to do so by pressing on your thumb, your index finger, your your ring finger, and your pinky. Your ring finger would be pressing on the different portions of the heart to be able to, or your fingers in general would be able to press on the different portions of your heart to be able to stimulate and or function in the same sense as how a heart itself contracts. Because your heart doesn't contract all at once. If that were the case, then your blood would be pushed through your body at far too quick of a rate and would likely zip out of your veins and cause large amounts of rips and tears amongst your veins and arteries. Though evolution might have made it easier for that to occur, you would be able to do so by just simply and getting into a rhythm within your head on how to do it correctly. Now do note, you don't want to have to do that. You never really want to have to go about your way to go and reach your hand into a patient's chest solely to be able to encourage heart palpitations. You would technically also be able to conduct as such through CPR. CPR, as well as active breathing, will assist an individual with their heart's cycle itself and utilizing of an AED. Does anybody know what an AED is? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then allow for me to educate you all on what an AED is in full. An automatic electronic defibrillator. Now, what is that? If you've ever seen on those weird picture shows in black and white, there are machines that they have that have electrical pads that which they place on certain sections of the body to be able to stimulate the heart's electronic pulsation to return once more. You do not want to place them directly on the center of the chest, as that will cause the lungs potentially to explode and gain all of the electronic pulse through them. The places that you would want to place your electronic pads are as follows. You would place one on the side of their chest, just underneath their areola, their chest pec region, just to the side down below here, on the side there, and one just to the right of where their heart would be itself. The reason why you would want this, but you would still ensure that it was not directly on the diaphragm, because you do not want it to be shocking their diaphragm, but you would want it up closer towards their collarbone, middle, like just below their collarbone on their ribs area. The reason why you would want it there is so that the electricity that is sent through their heart has 2 connection points that it is going to connect to, and the center point that these electrical pieces would be connecting to within their bodies would connect in a relatively equal point between these 2 spaces, being where their heart is itself. So again, you would want it just below the pec on to the left for one of these pads, and just above the diaphragm, just a fair bit, and below the collarbone, just to the right of the heart on the other side. And then you would ensure that nobody else was touching them, and then you would shout out clear to ensure that nobody else touched them, because if somebody was touching somebody while an AED was going off, then they too potentially and most likely will get shocked, and then also require CPR to be able to continue, as it might turn off their heart as well. Yes.
Also, isn't another reason for the positionings so that way it can provide enough resistance? Because putting them directly over would cause the heart to pop due to the pure current, whereas the positionings cause a resistance in between
Yes.
by how much it has to go through.
It's mostly, in terms of the AED, a muscular contraction of the areas that surround the heart that squeeze it back into its rhythm. You don't want to specifically shock the heart, but the residual electronical interference and tampering does provide enough of the energy needed for the neurons and within the nervous system to be able to reactivate the heart's normal cycle. Yes.
I'm just trying to confirm something I've learned in the past. I know using this system is bad on children of the age of 5, and like the 5 and below, and older folk, being the age of 60 and above.
Yes.
Oh.
Are you asking the reason why?
Yeah.
This is the case usually because for the younger patients, their bodies aren't as developed and or as durable as those of adult or teenage patients. The similar could be said for that of the elderly patients, but their bodies are more so deteriorated versus being underdeveloped. If you were to actively shock an elderly patient's heart, it could just straight up stop it or interfere with other devices that are already currently interfering with their heart's normal cycle, such as what's the word for it? It's sometimes defined as a ticker, but it is...
Pacemakers.
Yes, pacemaker, that's what it is. It might interfere with pacemakers, it might interfere with any metals that they have in their bodies from their years and years of life. It might even just straight up just destroy the the muscles that are around the heart itself to be impossible to fix a heart attack at that point. Most of the time, it's due to weakness at which it is occurring, and as such, shocking something that is weak versus non-compliant would more so weaken it versus assist it in its rise. Any questions? None back there? Very well. Then I will continue on by reading as such. Blood leaving the heart to circulate through the body is arterial blood. It is full of oxygen that will be delivered through arteries to the rest of the body. The largest artery leaving the body is called the aorta. Make sure you write that down. But whenever you are looking at blood, does anybody know the telltale signs and the differences between oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood? Yes, Shion.
The coloration.
Yes.
Oxygenated blood is red, whereas deoxygenated is blue and or considered technically a purple.
Yes. You will never find deoxygenated blood outside of the body. Now, does anybody know the reason why for that? Shion.
The second it leaves your body, it starts to end up mixing with the air around it because of technically it's the covalent bonds starting to connect, making the process of oxygenated air same as lungs.
Indeed. So, if ever you are coming across a patient and you are in an environment in which oxygen is low already, you will be able to tell the definition of their injury based off of whether or not their skin itself is showing signs of suffocation. If their blood itself is red, then there is obviously enough oxygen and their body has received damage enough from something other than, suffocation that is caused as such. And as such, you should be worried and you should be cautious as approaching this body, as it could be that this has been left as bait, or it could be in the sense that something else has gone awry and you need to be cautious yourself. Check the surroundings, check the area, and follow your normal protocols that you learned when you went through healer training. Yes.
The statement to that, Isn't it also technically that's why the skin technically becomes pale? Is one due to loss of warmth, but also due to the blood losing its oxygenation levels,
Yes.
adding a more bluish, dull tone.
Skin becoming cold and clammy, write that down. Skin becoming cold and clammy defines that there is less oxygen or less blood that is within those regions. This also can showcase itself through a process known as, I believe, hypotension. I believe it is hypotension, in which the body itself, or more so the blood itself, is in such a state in which the blood vessels are constricted to such a degree that which blood is not able to produce or not able to transfer warmth and or oxygen to the external limbs to be able to sustain homeostasis. Then you have the inverse of hypertension, where there is so much blood that is going through that there is not enough oxygen for blood vessels or blood cells, and as such there is less oxygen within the body, but there is more movement of the blood vessels themselves, causing in itself a heat up to arise within the body, but a lacking of oxygen nonetheless. Hyper is HYPER tension, and hypo is HYPO tension. Are there any questions before I continue?
My internet is extremely laggy looking at the stream and I'm getting low quality. Can I get like a copy of the slides?
There will be a copy posted later.
Cool.
As to answer a couple of the things in the chat presently. No, deoxygenated blood is not blue, it only looks blue through the skin. Yes, that is correct, but it is still in fact deoxygenated blood. It doesn't matter specifically the color, it is easy to identify which of the blood vessels are in fact not transporting oxygenated blood by way of looking at the color. Doesn't have to be specifically blue, it is just more recognizably blue from the exterior. But beyond that, let me finish off this section. Ooh, backwards a bit. We'll finish off this section by going over the last bit of the note point down below of blood coming back to the heart from the body is called venous blood. It has dropped off all its oxygen and is carrying carbon dioxide that will be brought back to the lungs to be exhaled. It enters the heart through two large veins called the vena cavas. You can also find the said vena cava there just above the heart, right within the circulatory picture on the right. Superior vena cava is just above the pulmonary artery and just below the subclavian vein, and the inferior vena cava is just around the midpoint in the middle of your intestine area that is connected along the way of your it's not so much the spinal area, but is along that same axis point, or that line. Are there any questions? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 hand. Wonderful. We'll now move on to the nervous system. Within the nervous system, similar to that of the different races I've already defined with the respiratory systems, the nervous system. You have two primary sections that you need to focus on when it comes to the nervous system. You have the central nervous system that is based off of the brain and its nerves that are connected to the brain, and that of the spinal cord, which connects it's the brain and its peripheral nervous systems, of which you'll be reading into next on the other side. The peripheral nervous system carries messages to and from the central nervous system. If your brain is telling your spine to tell its peripheral nervous system, hey, I need my heart to beat, the brain will send its signals to the spinal cord into the peripheral nervous system, and it will go through its necessary processes to be able to do so. You have the somatic nervous system, which is amongst the peripheral nervous system's field, which controls voluntary muscles and transmits sensory information to the central nervous system. This is what allows for you to be able to perceive feeling and touch on your skin. Then you have autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary body functions. This is inclusive of digestion within your body, or non-necessary breathing, as in like your automatic breathing, as well as heart function, as well as brain function. Your brain will function regardless of itself, inclusive of sometimes putting you into that NREM and REM cycle within sleep. Then you have from the autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic nervous system, which arouses body to expend energy or produce movement, It's a nervous system that encourages, or at least sends from your brain, the desire for you to raise your hand, lower it down, to lower your diaphragm or lift it up in breathing, or things of that nature. And the parasympathetic nervous system calms body to conserve and maintain energy. This is sometimes conducted whenever you are at rest in itself. This is what allows for you to become at rest. Some things that you all will need to know from the nervous system are the nerves itself. You have the dendrite, which are tendrils that are connected to the nucleus in the cell body of a nerve, which is inclusive of the axon, which connects it to the rest of the nerve itself, with its large tail that connects it to the myelin sheaths and the nodes of Ranvier. And you have the direction of the impulse stemming from the nerve itself point all the way through and cyclically going back into it from different nerves that are connected to that one specifically, which then are connected by way of from one nerve to another by way of the axon terminals and the synapses. Synapses are what allow for the electronic signals to pass between each other within a nerve itself. Are there any questions?
What is the difference between the axon and the cell body, since they're so similar, the definition-wise?
The axon is more so the long end or connection point to itself to the rest of the nodes of Ranvier and the myelin sheaths. It is what connects the nerve itself to others, essentially. Well, the base of what begins to connect these things. Like the base of a tree trunk. Are there any questions?
No, if we can hold here for a second.
What do you need?
I'm writing down the different sections bullet pointed.
Ah, okay. And yes, as the people in the chat said, not all nerve cells look exactly like that, but that is a good representation at the very basest form of what they might potentially look like in terms of looking at them with an extremely good microscope. Yes.
How would, if a nervous system is triggered or damaged, what would happen to it if the nervous system, part of that is damaged, could not be repaired?
If parts of the nervous system itself were damaged, it would likely be that they would be unable to send or transmit information to a place that they were being directed to previously. If in the case of somebody snapping your neck, ripping the spinal cord and breaking of the cervical spinal sections or the vertebrae that there exist within there, it would cut off a great deal amount of the nervous system's connection from the brain to the rest of the nervous system in general, to the peripheral systems, and to the rest of its spinal cord section. What this would mean is that all functions that would be going from the brain would be stopped at that break point and would no longer be able to pass through into the rest, thus leading essentially to death. If it were somewhere further down the spine, such as just between your shoulder blades and up a tiny bit, or just below a tiny bit in terms of your shoulder blades, if that vertebrae were to be snapped, shattered, or damaged in such a degree that it would break, you could potentially send your diaphragm and your lungs into an pain relapse, where the signals that exist within your spinal cord and the nervous system there that are continuously being sent to have you breathe would go into overdrive and cause you to breathe so rapidly and furiously that your lungs could either pop or go into such a shock that you don't get any of the oxygen benefits of your lungs being useful, or in general, it would just cause all of that section within your torso overall to just stop functioning itself entirely, sending it into a seizure of sorts internally, meaning your heart would beat so irregularly fast that it might, in general, just stop working or die or pop or rip in some form or fashion. Same as your lungs, same as your arteries and your veins and capillaries. Anything potentially could go wrong there. In terms of damages accrued unto the nervous system. But for more so for the specific pieces in terms of the peripheral nervous system, those parts would be, how do you say, less likely to remain damaged forever. If you eventually were able to seek treatment and help for these injuries that were accrued, you would be able to, at some point along the way, get them healed up just generally over time. Everybody say hello to Luca.
Hello, Luca.
Hi, Luca.
He's a good cat, this Luca.
You're not your human. You're not your human.
Yeah, well, he will be. Are there any questions? Five, four. What was that?
I need a few more moments to write down.
Yep, you have your time. In terms of the nervous system for different races, obviously the Nefeshi body does not operate any longer in a similar sense as a normal human living entity. However, the nervous system still operates in its own right and fashion, where a Nefeshi's energy connects itself, more specifically, and takes over that of the myelin sheath. And in its own sense, these Nefeshi energies stimulate these nerves in a similar sense as the synapses would, but more directly onto the connections of the axons. Then just more so forcing a connection and forcing responses instead of it being a more an automatic process conducted by the brain itself. The Nefeshi energy is what takes over the movements of an entity's body versus the normal nervous system's functions, as well as the rest of the systems that persist within a humanoid body. I'll give you just a bit longer. 5 to 10 minutes worth of time. Though I don't think you'll need that much time. Yes.
So since it's the energy that maintains the body at the moments that things like anti-magic or such things are introduced, that's why the body slowly begins to die, because at that moment there's nothing to keep the processes going.
Yes.
or allowed to the continuation of them.
With anti-magic. Anti-magic is something that which ultimately produces with amongst itself a field. From research retrieved from the Insane Asylum Island off the coast of Babylon, the researchers there had begun their experiments first on the tests to see how anti-magic affected, at the base level, slime folk and some rat folk. They tested first the slime folk to see what would occur if an anti-magic crystal was placed in the same room as them. The slime folk reported that their bodies seemed to be much more difficult to move and wander and be controlled by them, but were still able to maintain their shape and size. Then, next, an anti-magic crystal was placed on the table in front of one, and they were unable to move their arms or lift their head or turn their head away from the place that they were locked previously. Then the final test was conducted by placing an anti-magic crystal inside of a slime folk's body. This caused the slime folk to shimmer and shake before ultimately their body was then dispelled, causing the death of the slime folk itself. For the rat folk, the test was a bit different, in the sense where they placed it in the room, and the rat folk seemed relatively fine. You placed it closer, and the rat folk was still fine, but you place it even closer, and you have the rat folk put it in its mouth, and it was fine. But when you look at it through different reading machines, inclusive of the energy level machines at which are currently being produced by the Soul Institute, if you look at a rat folk who has an anti-magic crystal within their mouth, you would note that you would no longer be able to tell or check to see what exactly was going on with the energy levels that consisted within that rat folk. Now, some rat folk have a natural attunement to the world itself by way of simply bloodlines. Now, that's a whole other topic entirely, but to note, some rat folk with their bio-coded technology were incapable of accessing or utilizing their bio-coded technology due to interference from anti-magic crystals. Are there any questions in relation to that?
Have we noticed anything else amongst the other different kinds of races, or were rat folk the only ones primarily tested?
Lab rats were quite often tested at the time, but in terms of the Nefeshi, whenever they are exposed to an anti-magic crystal, their connection sources to their originating points of energy are diminished. If they are weaker, then they are usually erased entirely until they are able to exit out of that field in which the connections can be reattached. Or, if they are of a stronger variant, their connections are weakened solely to that of a simple thread versus a rope that which might connect them previously. Yes.
So, technically, how would that work for Lichlings? Because they have no direct connections, but they still maintain off of their sources.
For a Lichling, as well as any entity really that produces their own energy from themselves and expels it from themselves in some form or fashion. Anti-magic would be able to then disable or disrupt the synapses that would send these energy signals, quite literally, out from their body, and more so stop them at the wall of their skin, keeping the energy reactions within their body and disabling any sort of casting that could occur.
Were there any knowledgeable people, or knowledgeable enough people who were able to stop it in its crux, basically?
What do you mean?
Via their energies. Replicating frequencies. So imagine if coming from Fae and or, say, a Elohim, trying to replicate the frequencies at which that they came from to dispel.
Very, 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 very few people would be able to replicate a frequency of that which is produced by anti-magic. Some overpower their frequencies and cause the crystals to shatter, allowing for them to continue their daily castings or dealings. But It is unlikely that there are many or even any entities that exist out in the wilds of our world aside from bards and sound mages who could potentially match the frequencies of anti-magic crystals and cause them to shatter from a distance outside of direct energy influence. Has everybody gotten the notes written down? Raise your hand if you have, or if you have them in some form or fashion. Yes, Madam Cat in the background.
No, I have them written down. I'm just jumping to say yeah.
Wonderful. Raise your hand if you've gotten them written down. Or not. Either fashion works.
Cat stuck on me.
Wonderful. Then, I would like for you all to take the bananas that you have on your desks, open them, and then eat them. This has been a lot of information in which you have thus been provided in this class, and it has likely been a bit overwhelming in some pieces to at least keep track of everything that potentially you might have learned. So eat your bananas, ensure you have nutrients and food, and you are free for this evening, at least until the next class is conducted. This has been the first lesson in terms of the surgeon or the Syndicate Anatomy 101, going over the nervous system, the respiratory system, circulatory system, and the digestive system. The next lesson, lesson 2, will be a shorter lesson, but it will include the muscular system and the skeletal systems of numerous different types of races that exist within our universe and our realm of this syndicate of ours. Thank you all for coming through to lesson 1. If you have any questions, I'll be around for around 10 minutes after class, and which I will be able to answer your questions in varying spurts and sprees. If you did not get the notes, this notes will be posted in this format on this lovely little channel known as twitch.tv/GrandVitoMoto. If you would like to know more or be able to research more into this stuff, stay tuned as I'll be conducting little sprees of information that I post out every so often. This can come in the forms of short videos as well as clips that are taken from Twitch themselves, or in general just different class sessions such as this. Thank you all for coming through, and to the class, to the students that are currently within my class, you'll be given a chance that which those in the chat will not be able to have the same of, in which you'll be able to ask specific questions to me for the next 10 minutes once I end this stream. I will, let's see here, who is currently streaming out in the wilds of Twitch? Nobody that I know, so I'm not going to worry about it. Somebody's outside. Don't know why they're here. Don't know why they're still on your friends list, Madam Princess. That one if you looked outside. But I will end the stream. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for coming through.